I used to think silence was just a personality type. Some people hate conflict. Some people process slowly. Some people need time. So when our CFO, Grant Holloway, went quiet in meetings, I told myself it was executive style. Measured, controlled, above the noise. That story held up right until the day I watched him use silence like a guillotine. It happened in a conference room with glass walls and a long walnut table. The kind of room where everyone sits a little straighter because the room itself feels expensive. We were reviewing the quarterly close. Nothing dramatic. A handful of schedule slips, a few recon items, the usual list of, "We'll clean it up next month." Then Kelly from Accounts Payable asked a basic, correct question. She wasn't accusing anyone. She wasn't emotional. She just pointed to a line item on the vendor spend report and said calmly, "Can we confirm why this consulting vendor is coded as operational maintenance? It's showing as recurring, and the description doesn't match the scope." Grant didn't look at her. He didn't answer. He simply flipped his notebook closed, leaned back in his chair, and stared at the wall behind her as if she'd become a low-quality noise the room should ignore. It was subtle, but I saw the chain reaction. The controller stopped tapping his pen. The FP&A manager's shoulders dropped. Someone next to me shifted their laptop angle away, like even a screen could be interpreted as disloyal. Silence filled the space where a normal executive would have said, "Good catch, we'll validate it." Instead, Grant's silence said, "How dare you make me explain myself?" Kelly tried again, softer this time. "I'm only asking because the monthly amount is consistent, and it's impacting—" Grant raised one hand, not a stop sign, not a gesture of anger, just a small, lazy lift of two fingers, like he was dismissing a fly. Kelly closed her mouth mid-sentence. Then Grant turned his head toward the CEO and began talking about revenue recognition, as if Kelly had never existed. The CEO followed along, relieved. The whole room followed along, grateful to be allowed back into the safe current of the meeting. Kelly sat there staring at her notes, face still, but I watched the color drain from her cheeks. That was the first moment I understood. The silence wasn't passive. It was disciplinary. After the meeting, she passed me in the hallway with her head down. I stopped her and asked if she was okay. She gave me a tight smile and said, "I'm fine. I shouldn't have asked it in the room." That sentence bothered me more than the question she'd asked, because she was right. In this place, you didn't ask certain questions where anyone could hear. I wasn't new. I'd been at Sterling and Rowe Holdings for almost 6 years, mid-sized public company, multiple subsidiaries, complex procurement, heavy vendor spend, and just enough growth to keep everyone busy without forcing anyone to tighten controls. My title was Director of Internal Audit. People hear audit and picture spreadsheets and clipboards. In reality, I spent most of my days in conference calls, process maps, access logs, and polite conversations where everyone tried to convince me that exceptions were normal. My job wasn't to accuse people, it was to trace decisions back to evidence. And evidence doesn't care who gets offended. The pattern around Grant became obvious once I was paying attention. When he wanted something approved fast, he was warm. He'd call you by name. He'd compliment your work. He'd say, "I appreciate you staying on top of this." But the second you slowed him down with a policy, a control, or a question, he disappeared. Emails got no reply. Calendar invites vanished. Your approvals sat in limbo. And if you pushed too hard, he'd come back with one sentence so short it felt like a slap. "Handle it. Not needed. Closed. No context. No discussion. Just silence." Then a command. It trained people. It trained them fast. I saw it in procurement. Vendors got emergency onboarded without full due diligence. I saw it in AP. Invoices got paid because Grant said so, even if the purchase order didn't match. I saw it in finance operations, where one person quietly stopped documenting exceptions at all, because there's no point. The company still looked fine from the outside. Our financials were clean enough, No missed filings. No obvious fraud. That's the part people don't understand. Most real problems don't look like a crime scene. They look like culture. They look like fear. And fear always leaves footprints if you know where to look. My turning point came 2 weeks after that meeting, on a Tuesday that started like any other. I was in my office with the door half open, answering routine audit follow-ups. My phone buzzed with a Teams message from Kelly. It was just 4 words. "Can I talk privately?" I told her to come up. She arrived 5 minutes later, holding a folder like a shield. Her hands were steady, but her voice wasn't. "I shouldn't be doing this," she said before she even sat down. I didn't rush her. People don't report things when they feel safe. They report things when they feel cornered. "You're not in trouble," I said. "Just tell me what's happening." She opened the folder and slid a printed invoice across my desk. Vendor, Arden Bridge Consulting. Amount, $178,000. Description, operational maintenance services, and the invoice date was the day before, which meant it had already been paid or was being rushed. "What is Arden Bridge?" I asked. Kelly swallowed. "I don't know. No one knows. It came in through the CFO queue. It doesn't have a purchase order. No contract in the repository. No onboarding packet. Just an email from Grant's assistant telling us to pay it same day." "Has this happened before?" She nodded, then looked at the floor. "Monthly, for almost a year." That made my stomach tighten in a very calm, technical way. The way it does when your brain stops reacting emotionally and switches into pure pattern recognition. "Do you have the history?" I asked. Kelly hesitated. I pulled it, quietly, before the system locks me out again. She slid over another sheet. A payment ledger extract. Arden Bridge Consulting. Same amount, every month like clockwork. $8.4 million over 12 months. I didn't say anything for a few seconds. I just stared at the numbers, not because I was shocked by the amount, but because the structure was too clean. Real consulting spend fluctuates. Scope changes. Hours change. Deliverables change. This didn't. This was a drip, a siphon, a metronome. Kelly spoke again, voice barely above a whisper. I asked for backup once. Grant didn't answer. 2 days later, my system access changed. I couldn't see vendor master details anymore. IT said it was role cleanup, and I shouldn't worry. "And you stopped asking?" She nodded, ashamed. I leaned back and forced myself to breathe slowly, because I could feel my own anger trying to rise. And anger in my role was a liability. What I needed wasn't a confrontation. What I needed was proof so solid it couldn't be silenced. I looked at Kelly and said, "You did the right thing coming here." Her eyes watered. "I'm scared." "I know," I said. "Here's what we're going to do. You're going to go back downstairs and behave like nothing happened. No more screenshots. No more extra pulls. You don't touch Arden Bridge again unless I ask you." She nodded quickly. "And if anyone asks why you came up here, you tell them you needed clarification on an audit request." "Okay." She stood to leave, then paused at the door like she wanted to say something else. "What is it?" I asked. She turned back and her voice got steadier, almost resentful. "He makes you feel crazy," she said, "like you're the problem for noticing." Then she left, and the moment the door closed, I opened a new document on my laptop and typed one line at the top. Arden Bridge Consulting, Vendor Legitimacy and Payment Authorization Review. I didn't know it yet, but that decision would cost them everything. When someone uses silence as punishment, it isn't leadership style. It's control. In real companies, fraud rarely starts with a forged signature. It starts by training people not to ask. If a recurring vendor spend has no contract, no purchase order, and no owner, it's not a vendor, it's a channel. And channels leave trails. The next morning, I didn't launch an investigation. That phrase gets people hurt. I opened my calendar, blocked 2 hours under the blandest title I could think of, close support, and started building the case the way you build anything in a company like ours. quietly in small, defensible steps. First, scope. Arden Bridge Consulting, recurring invoices, no purchase order, no contract in the repository. Same amount, same cadence, 8.4 million across 12 months. Second, control points. Vendor onboarding, vendor master changes, invoice approval workflow, payment release, bank details, role-based access, system logs. Third, my risk. Because Grant didn't need to scream to stop someone. All he had to do was remove them from the flow of information until they couldn't function. And then his silence got louder. I started with procurement because it's the cleanest narrative. A vendor should exist there before it exists anywhere else. I walked down 2 floors with a printed process map in my hand, like I was doing routine SOX walkthroughs. Jared, our procurement manager, gave me a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He'd seen enough audits to know the difference between annual compliance and someone is about to get exposed. I'm reviewing vendor onboarding controls, I said. Arden Bridge, do you have a file? He didn't even pretend to check. That one's handled by finance, he said too quickly. CFO side? Finance can pay, I said. Procurement onboards. That's how the policy reads. Jared exhaled, glanced at the glass wall of his office, then lowered his voice. I've never seen a packet, he admitted. No due diligence, no W-9, no insurance cert, nothing. It's not in our queue. Did you ever request it? I did once. I emailed Grant's assistant. No response. What happened after? Jared's jaw tightened. My access to the vendor portal got reviewed. For 2 weeks, I couldn't approve new vendors without a director override. There it was again. The punishment wasn't loud, it was procedural. I thanked him, kept my face neutral, and asked for something he could safely give without getting flagged. A list of vendors onboarded outside procurement for the last 18 months. Not the files, just the names and dates. He hesitated, then nodded. I can export that. It's not sensitive. It was sensitive. We both knew it, but it wasn't a smoking gun yet, which meant it was survivable. Back upstairs, I didn't email anyone. Email creates a target. I pulled data directly from our ERP invoice history for Arden Bridge, approval chain, timestamps, and the user IDs attached to each step. Then I pulled vendor master details, address, tax, ID field, payment terms, bank routing, and account mask view. The vendor address was a suite number in a business park in New Jersey. Not impossible. But it was generic in a way that made my skin itch, like a placeholder someone forgot to replace. Then I hit the first wall. The vendor master change log tab was grayed out for me. I still had internal audit access, but not the audit trail for vendor edits. That wasn't a glitch. That was intent. I called IT security, not help desk, not the general queue. I called Mara, the security analyst I'd worked with on access reviews last quarter. She picked up on the second ring. I need a read-only export, I said. Vendor master change logs for one vendor. Audit request. What vendor? Arden Bridge Consulting. A pause. I heard typing. Then another pause that felt heavier. That name is flagged, she said carefully. Flagged how? Not an incident. Just restricted visibility. Someone changed the permissions on vendor audit logs 2 weeks ago. Only finance systems admin can view. 2 weeks ago, right after Kelly asked her question, I kept my voice even. Can you tell me who approved that permission change? I can't in the tool, Mara said, but I can tell you it wasn't automatic. Then I need a formal access exception for internal audit, I said. Single vendor, time-bound, logged. Mara exhaled like she was measuring the risk of helping me. If I do this, it creates a ticket. It shows up. I know, I said. I'll own it. She was quiet for a second, then said, send me the request through the audit portal, not email. Put SOX control testing in the header. That gets it routed differently. That was her way of saying yes without saying yes. I filed the request, attached the policy excerpt, and copied only 2 people. My VP of Audit Nina Patel and our compliance counsel, Victor Lang. Both of them had the authority to protect the work once it existed. Nina called me 10 minutes later. "You're poking the CFO," she said. "I'm tracing a control failure," I replied. "If it's clean, it dies quietly. If it's not, we need to be ahead of it." A pause. "What do you need from me?" "Cover," I said, "and a board-level escalation path if my access gets cut." Nina didn't hesitate. "You have it." That should have calmed me, but it didn't, because I knew how fast Grant moved when he felt threatened. By noon, I got a calendar invite from his assistant. Subject: quick sync. No agenda. No body text. That was Grant's favorite trick. A meeting with no record of what was discussed. I declined it. Then instead of replying, I added a one-line note in the audit work paper. CFO office requested ad hoc meeting. Declined pending agenda to maintain audit independence. It was small, it was formal, and it was the first time I'd written his pressure down where it couldn't be erased. At 3 that afternoon, Mara sent me a secure link. Export attached. Vendor master change log for Arden Bridge Consulting. I opened it and felt my pulse tighten. The bank account details had been updated multiple times. Small edits, spaced out, each one done by the same admin user, fin-sys-admin. But the approvals for those changes? They were documented as if they were approved by a procurement director who had left the company the previous year. Not forged signatures, something worse. A ghost approver. I scrolled down to the earliest change. There it was. The vendor was created without a tax ID, then updated later. Created without a contract reference, then linked to a contract number that didn't exist in our repository. And the creation date? 11 months ago. 3 days after Grant had moved payment authority thresholds during process optimization. I sat back and stared at the screen, not because I was confused, but because the shape of it was now undeniable. They thought I was gone. I wasn't. I copied the export into a locked audit folder, generated a hash value for the file as evidence integrity, and sent Nina a message with one sentence. I have vendor master change logs. The approver is a ghost. Then I looked back at the bank field and noticed something I hadn't expected. The routing number belonged to a major bank, but the account type indicator was set to international clearing. Arden Bridge wasn't just a fake vendor. It was a pipe, and I still didn't know where it led. In corporate fraud, the first goal is not stealing money. It's controlling visibility. When access changes happen right after a question, treat it as evidence, not coincidence. Always move through formal channels that generate immutable logs. They protect you when pressure arrives. And never accept quick sync meetings with no agenda when you're documenting a control failure. By the time I got home that night, I wasn't thinking about $8.4 million. I was thinking about how many people had been trained to look away. Because a fraud that survives 11 months inside a public company doesn't survive on cleverness. It survives on social engineering, on silence, on the slow rearranging of everyone's incentives until truth feels like a career risk. I ate standing up at my kitchen counter, barely tasting anything, then opened my laptop again. Not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't afford to wait. If Arden Bridge was a pipe, I needed to know 2 things: where the money actually went and who was benefiting. The problem was bank data is where companies suddenly get privacy conscious. Even internal audit gets pushback, especially when it touches senior leadership. And Grant knew every rule well enough to weaponize it. So I stopped trying to pull the destination from the payment system directly. Instead, I built the story from the edges. I opened the vendor ledger and pulled every single payment instruction tied to Arden Bridge. Invoice number, payment date, payment batch ID, treasury release time, and the approval user IDs. Then I pulled the payment batches for the same days and looked for patterns. The pattern hit me fast. Arden Bridge payments always went out in the final treasury batch of the day, right before the automated cutoff. That's when oversight is weakest. People are tired. Exceptions get waved through. So we don't miss the bank window. And the release approval? Always Grant. Not delegated, not proxy. His user ID. He wasn't just aware. He was physically pressing the button. I wrote that down in the work paper. Treasury release approvals for Arden Bridge payments. Executed by CFO user. ID consistently in final daily batch. Then I did something I don't do often. I walked into Nina's office and closed the door behind me. She looked up from her screen and immediately read my face. "You found the channel," she said. "I found the hand on the lever," I replied, and handed her the vendor change log printout with the ghost approver highlighted. Nina didn't skim it. She read it slowly, like someone measuring how much pain a document can carry. "This is a material weakness," she said quietly. "It's worse," I said. "This is active control suppression." She tapped the paper once with her finger. "What's your next move?" "I need cash destination," I said, "and I need it in a way Grant can't choke off." Nina leaned back. "You'll need Treasury." "I know. Then you need someone in Treasury who won't fold." We both thought of the same name. Elliot Park, Treasury Director. Quiet, technical, allergic to politics. The kind of person Grant hated because Elliot didn't react to intimidation. He simply asked for documentation. Nina called him from my office line. No email, no calendar invite, just a direct call. Elliot answered. Nina kept it simple. "Elliot, internal audit needs a cash tracing review. High sensitivity. Can you meet in person in 10? He said, "Yes," like it was a weather report. When he arrived, he brought a small notebook, no laptop. That told me he understood the rules of the room. I walked him through the Arden Bridge pattern, the recurring payments, the ghost approvals, the access restriction, the international clearing indicator. Elliot didn't interrupt. He just listened, then asked one question. "Do you have the payment batch IDs?" I slid the list over. He studied it for a moment, then nodded once. "I can pull the bank confirmation files." "That's what I need." He looked at Nina, then back at me. "If I do that, Grant will see the access in the Treasury reporting tool." "I know," I said. "So we do it once. We do it clean. We export, we lock it, and we document chain of custody." Elliot's eyes narrowed slightly, not in fear, more like focus. "Understood," he said. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. "You should also know," he added, "that Grant requested a change last quarter. He wanted Treasury confirmations routed only to his office." Nina's expression hardened. "And did you do it?" she asked. Elliot shook his head. I pushed back, told him bank confirmations are a segregation of duties control. He didn't respond. Then he stopped inviting me to close meetings. Silence again. Always the same tool. Elliot stood. "Give me 1 hour," he said. "Don't email me. Don't message me. I'll bring you what I can print." When he left, I sat down and realized my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of what was about to happen. Because once Treasury confirms where the cash went, there's no going back to, maybe it's a misunderstanding. And I could already feel the company's instinct forming. Protect the brand, minimize the optics, keep it quiet. That night, I stopped being the hero. I became something colder. I became a record. An hour later, Elliot returned and slid a stack of printed bank confirmation pages onto the table. No headers that would scream fraud, just boring Treasury documentation, dates, transaction IDs, beneficiary account numbers partially masked, and a reference field. He pointed to the first Arden Bridge payment line, beneficiary, a holding company name I'd never seen before. Not Arden Bridge, not even close. It was something bland and generic, Harbor K Holdings. I flipped through the next confirmations. Every single Arden Bridge payment ended up in Harbor K Holdings. Same beneficiary bank, same routing family, same masked account ending. Then Elliot pointed to a tiny detail in the reference field, a 3-letter code. See that? He asked. What is it? I said. It's an internal treasury tag, Elliot replied. It's used to mark payments that are part of executive confidentiality routing. Usually severance, litigation settlements, occasionally acquisitions. My mouth went dry. Because if Grant had managed to classify a recurring fake vendor payment as executive confidential, he wasn't just hiding it from employees. He was hiding it from normal governance. He was exploiting a legitimate process designed to protect sensitive legal matters, and he was using it to siphon money. Nina looked at me. Can you trace Harbor K? I can try, I said, already thinking. Harbor K Holdings might be a real shell, or it might be a pass-through to something else. But it had one weakness every shell has. It exists somewhere, on paper, with a registration, with officers, and officers have names. I pulled up our vendor master again and searched for Harbor K. Nothing. I searched our contract repository. Nothing. I searched legal settlement logs. Nothing. Which meant Harbor K wasn't a vendor. It was purely a bank beneficiary, a destination outside our normal systems. I stared at the confirmation pages again, then noticed another thing, the payment release timestamp. Every payment was released within minutes of Grant's user ID approval. He wasn't delegating to an assistant. He wasn't letting Treasury do its job. He was controlling the timing, which meant he was watching the cash move. Nina's voice was low. We need board involvement. Yes, I said, but we need to enter that room with a narrative so tight he can't talk around it. Elliot tapped the paper again. There's one more thing, he said. He flipped to the last page and pointed to a different transaction on the same days, a separate payment, smaller amounts, 50 to 70,000, sent to the same beneficiary bank, same routing family, but a different holding company name. And the memo field? Strategic Advisory. I felt the ground shift, because it wasn't just Arden Bridge. It was a network. Multiple pipes, same drain. And Grant wasn't the kind of man who builds a network unless he expects to keep it for a long time. I looked at Nina and said the truth out loud. This isn't accounting sloppiness, I said. This is architecture. And I knew in that moment the company was going to test whether I'd flinch, whether I'd accept quiet pressure, whether I'd let the story die in silence. I didn't know it yet, but the real fight wasn't going to be about money. It was going to be about who controls the record. When you're up against senior power, proof isn't one document. It's a chain that shows intent, control, and repetition. Treasury confirmations often reveal what accounting systems conceal, because banks don't care about internal politics. Watch for legitimate processes repurposed as cover. Real fraud hides inside real workflows. And when multiple channels drain to the same bank, you're not looking at a mistake, you're looking at design. The next day started with a calendar notification that wasn't on my calendar the night before. My 9 a.m. close support block had been overwritten with a new meeting. Alignment, finance controls. Host, Grant, no agenda, mandatory attendance. And then my access vanished. I tried to open the audit work papers folder and got a clean, polite error. You do not have permission to view this content. Not even temporary outage. Not sync issue. A permission denial in broad daylight. I walked straight to Nina's office. They pulled my access, I said. Nina didn't look surprised. She was already on the phone with compliance counsel, Victor Lan. I could hear his voice through the speaker, controlled. Careful. Lock down what you already have, Victor was saying. We treat this as potential obstruction. Litigation hold starts now. Nina pointed at the chair in front of her desk. Sit. Don't react. Don't email anyone about losing access. Let legal do the talking. What about Grant's meeting? I asked. You're going, Nina said. You're going to let him think the silence still works. At 9 sharp, I walked into Grant's conference room. He was already seated at the head, hands folded, expression flat. 2 people from finance ops were there, stiff as mannequins. His assistant sat near the door with a notebook. But I noticed she wasn't writing, just watching. Grant didn't greet me, didn't offer coffee, didn't even perform the usual corporate warmth. He waited until I sat, then looked at me for the first time. "I'm hearing," he said slowly, "that you've been requesting sensitive finance data outside normal channels." No accusation, no raised voice, just a sentence designed to make everyone else in the room believe I was the problem. I kept my tone neutral. Internal audit requested vendor master change logs tied to a control review. The requests were logged. Grant stared at me in silence long enough to make the room itch. Then he said, "That vendor is executive confidential." "Then the controls should be stronger, not weaker," I replied. Another pause. Then almost casually, "You're disrupting operations." I didn't flinch. "I'm documenting exceptions that bypass procurement, onboarding, and segregation of duties. That is my role." Grant's mouth tightened the smallest amount. Then he did what he always did. He stopped speaking. He looked past me, at the window, like I wasn't worth words, like the meeting could end simply because he refused to continue it. For a second, I felt the old instinct: fill the silence, explain, soften, apologize. That's what he trained people to do. But I didn't. I opened my notebook, wrote down the time, and said evenly, "If you're instructing internal audit to stop control testing, I'll need that in writing for our records." That broke something in the room. One of the finance ops analysts shifted hard in his chair. The assistant's pen finally moved. One quick stroke. Grant's eyes returned to me, cold. "I'm not instructing you," he said. "I'm informing you." I nodded, noted, and I stood up and left. When I got back to my floor, Victor was waiting in Nina's office. He had the look of someone who'd already moved the chess pieces, while everyone else was still arguing about the rules. "We're escalating to the audit committee chair," he said. "Today. In person. No email trail until after council's engaged." Nina handed me a printed binder, my own work, reconstructed from what I'd already exported and locked before my access was cut. Vendor history, change logs, the ghost approver, treasury confirmations, beneficiary routing, the confidentiality tag misuse, and a new page on top that Nina had added it herself, an invoice. Vendor, Arden Bridge Consulting. Amount, $8.4 million. Description, annual retainer, true up. Invoice date, today. Payment terms, due immediately. Approval request already routed to Treasury. My throat went tight. "He's trying to move the full year in one shot," I said. Victor's voice stayed calm. "He's trying to outrun the record." Elliot from Treasury arrived 5 minutes later, face pale but steady. "It's in the outgoing queue," he said. "Final batch, just like the others." He's set it as executive confidential again. Nina looked at him. "Can you stop it?" Elliot nodded once. "I can place a payment hold in the Treasury system and flag the beneficiary accounts. But once I do, it triggers alerts." "Trigger them," Victor said, "and document the reason. Pending internal investigation, council directed hold." Elliot left without another word. I watched the door close and felt something shift in my chest, like the fear had finally found a place to go. They thought I was isolated. I wasn't. 2 hours later, we were in a smaller boardroom on the top floor. No glass walls, no audience. Just the people who mattered. Audit Committee Chair Evelyn Klein, Nina, Victor, and me. Evelyn was in her mid-60s, composed, the kind of leader who didn't waste emotion as a substitute for authority. She didn't ask for a dramatic summary, she asked for sequence. "Start with the first control failure," she said. So I did. Cleanly. Step by step. No speeches. Procurement bypassed. Vendor created without due diligence. Approval chain tied to an exited employee. Access restrictions implemented after a question. Repeated end-of-day batches. CFO user. ID approving releases. Bank confirmations showing Arden Bridge as a front. Funds going to Harbor K Holdings. Multiple pipes, same bank. confidential routing misuse. Then I slid the invoice across the table. And today, I said, an annual true-up invoice for $8.4 million entered the queue for immediate release. Evelyn didn't react theatrically. She simply looked at Victor. "Is this enough for immediate action?" she asked. Victor nodded. "Yes. Counsel directed. We can initiate a hold, engage forensic accounting, and place the CFO on administrative leave pending investigation." Evelyn looked at me. "Is the payment stopped?" I didn't answer. Elliot did, through Nina's phone on speaker. "Payment hold is active," Elliot said. "Beneficiary accounts have been blocked in our treasury templates. No wires to those accounts can be released without dual approval and a bank callback." Evelyn's gaze didn't change, but the air did. "Good," she said. "Then we control the cash." A knock came at the door. Grant walked in without waiting for permission. He didn't look surprised to see me. He looked irritated, like a schedule had been inconvenienced. Evelyn didn't stand, she didn't greet him. She pointed to the chair opposite her. "Sit," she said. Grant sat. Evelyn slid the invoice toward him. "Explain this," she said. Grant glanced down, then looked back up. No anger, no panic. Silence. The same tactic deployed at the highest level. As if the board chair was just another employee he could starve of answers. Evelyn waited exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, "Your payment has been frozen." That was the first crack, not on his face. He controlled that. But in his eyes, a small recalculation, like a man realizing the room had changed hands. Victor spoke next. "This is now counsel directed. Your system's access will be suspended pending an independent review. Do not contact Finance Ops, Treasury, or AP regarding this matter." Grant's jaw tightened. "You can't." Evelyn cut him off. "You don't get to decide what we can do. You've been using silence to control the record. We're done with that." Grant looked at me then, finally, directly, and I felt a quiet, precise satisfaction I hadn't allowed myself until that moment. Because his silence wasn't power anymore. It was evidence. When someone controls a company through silence, your antidote is sequence. Timestamps, logs, approvals, bank confirmations. Access cuts and agendaless meetings are not workplace drama. They're risk signals. A freeze isn't revenge. It's governance doing its job before cash becomes unrecoverable. The moment the board owns the record, intimidation stops working. By the time I got back to my desk, the building felt different. Not calmer, not safer, just awake. People think the climax of a story like this is the confrontation in a boardroom. It isn't. The real ending happens in the hours after, when a company decides whether it's going to protect a person or protect the process. And processes, unlike people, don't blink. At 11:30, my access came back, but not the way it used to be. A new folder appeared in my drive. Special review, counsel directed. Read only for most people. Full access for internal audit, outside counsel, and a small handful of IT security admins assigned by legal. The permissions were stamped with a litigation hold notice. Immutable. Victor had built a cage around the evidence. Nina called me into her office and closed the door. "Grant is on administrative leave effective immediately," she said. Security walked him out through the side exit. They took his laptop and badge. IT is imaging his devices. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like pressure leaving a room. "What happens next?" I asked. "Next is the part nobody romanticizes," Nina said. "Forensics, interviews, controls remediation, disclosure analysis." "And Harbor K?" I asked. Nina slid a printed page across the desk. Victor already moved on it. It was an engagement letter from a forensic accounting firm, one of the big ones. And below that, a short memo from outside counsel summarizing the immediate actions taken with the bank. The bank had been notified of suspected misdirection of corporate funds. The beneficiary accounts tied to Harbor K Holdings were flagged for enhanced scrutiny. And because Elliot had implemented the Treasury template blocks and callback controls, No additional wires could go out to those accounts without a documented verification process that involved more than one human. That was the difference between a company that panics and a company that governs. Elliot texted me one sentence: "Hold is holding." That might sound funny written down, but it hit me like a clean note of relief. Because the $8.4 million invoice Grant tried to push through, his true-up, had been stopped before the money could become a regret. The next 48 hours were disciplined chaos. Outside counsel ran interviews, not dramatic interrogations, structured sessions with 2 attorneys, 1 HR partner, and someone from my team taking factual notes. Kelly came first. She looked smaller than she had in my office, like she'd spent the night bracing for impact. But she told the truth, and the truth sounded exactly like what we'd already documented. Pressure to pay without backup, access changes after questions, silence used as punishment. Then Jared from procurement, then the finance ops analysts, then IT security, then treasury. Every story was different in detail, but identical in shape. Grant didn't need to threaten anyone because the consequences had been made obvious through pattern. Silence, isolation, career freeze. The forensics team started peeling the pipe. Harbor K Holdings, it turned out, was registered in Delaware through a formation service. The registered agent name meant nothing by itself, but the bank account opening documentation, requested through counsel, revealed something that made my stomach turn even though I'd expected it. The beneficial owner wasn't a stranger, it was a private trust, and the trustee's signature matched a name in Grant's personal disclosures file, his spouse. Not listed as an officer at our company, not an employee, just close enough to be not him, and far enough to give him deniability. It wasn't cinematic, it wasn't a secret offshore island. It was domestic, boring, and legally engineered. That's what real theft looks like when it's wearing a suit. On Friday afternoon, Evelyn called an emergency audit committee session. Formal minutes, formal counsel present, formal resolutions. The CFO's administrative leave was extended pending findings. A forensic review scope was approved. A control remediation plan was mandated on a compressed timeline. And then Evelyn did the one thing that told me she understood the cultural injury as well as the financial one. She ordered an internal communication, not a vague, "we take ethics seriously" paragraph, a real specific message that said, "A counsel-directed review is underway. Certain payments have been paused as a precaution. Employees are protected from retaliation for cooperating. Any changes to access or roles tied to this matter will be reviewed by compliance and legal. No names, no gossip, no drama. Just the company announcing in plain language that silence would not be the method of control anymore." That Monday, I got an email from Kelly. Not long. Just 2 lines. "Thank you for believing me. I slept for the first time in months." That hit harder than the money, because $8.4 million matters. But what Grant had really stolen was something else: the basic belief that questions are safe. 2 weeks later, the first formal finding dropped. Not fraud yet. That word gets used carefully, but misappropriation indicators consistent with intentional circumvention of controls. The evidence package was already board ready. Vendor onboarding failures documented with timestamps and policy references. Vendor master change logs showing unauthorized edits and ghost approvals. Payment batch patterns showing end-of-day routing and CFO user ID releases. Bank confirmations tying payments to Harbor K Holdings. Treasury tags showing misuse of executive confidential routing. Access restriction changes occurring shortly after employee questions. Forensic linkage between beneficiary ownership and Grant's related party. Grant's lawyer tried the usual angle: misunderstandings, confidential settlements, operational urgency, but every explanation collapsed under the same weight. The record didn't argue back, it just sat there. In the end, the company didn't need revenge. It needed recovery. Grant resigned before termination could be voted through, a last attempt to keep wording softer. It didn't work. The separation agreement was negotiated under counsel, and the board authorized a clawback action tied to breach of fiduciary duty and policy violations. The bank funds weren't fully recovered, money rarely comes back clean, but a meaningful portion was frozen and returned through legal pressure and account restrictions before it could be dispersed further. The rest became a civil matter that would take time. And internally, we rebuilt the control structure the way it should have been from the start. Dual approval on vendor master bank changes, always. Automated alerts when audit logs are restricted, always. Procurement onboarding enforced by system gates, always. Treasury callbacks for high-risk beneficiaries, always. And a simple, powerful rule: any retaliation through access changes triggers an independent review. A month later, I walked past the same glass conference room where Kelly had been erased with silence. Someone else was presenting vendor spend. A junior analyst asked a question, and nobody froze. The CFO seat was empty for now, filled by an interim leader who answered the question in a normal voice. Not warm, not perfect, just accountable. I sat down at my desk after that meeting and realized something I hadn't let myself believe earlier. Grant's silence had only worked because we treated it like power. But it was never power, it was a vacuum. And the moment we filled the vacuum with documentation, process, and governance, it collapsed under its own emptiness. I didn't walk away feeling like a hero. I walked away feeling something better. In control. Quiet justice in workplaces is rarely a single gotcha. It's governance reclaiming the record. If you want to beat intimidation, don't try to outshout it, outdocument it. A freeze, a hold, and a clean audit trail protect both the company and the people inside it. And the best ending isn't spectacle. It's a workplace where asking the right question becomes safe again,